The mountain gave way without warning. One moment Charlotte was leading her horse along the narrow trail above the old ghost town, and the next, the world became a roaring white chaos of snow and timber and stone. She didn't even have time to scream before the avalanche swallowed her whole, dragging her down into cold darkness that filled her mouth and lungs with suffocating weight. She couldn't tell which way was up, couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The pressure on her chest was unbearable, and somewhere in the terrifying void of her mind, she thought about her children back at the ranch and how they'd already lost one parent. She couldn't leave them alone. Not like this. Not buried in snow on a mountain where no one would ever find her body. Then, impossibly, there were hands. Strong hands digging through the snow with desperate speed, finding her shoulders, her arms, pulling with a strength that seemed superhuman. The weight lifted. Cold air hit her face. She gasped and choked, snow falling from her mouth as she was hauled upward through the debris. When her vision cleared enough to see, she found herself staring up at a man who looked like he'd been carved from the Montana wilderness itself. Coal-black hair fell across a face that was all hard angles and shadows. Dark eyes with flecks of amber burning with fierce intensity as he lifted her completely out of the snow like she weighed nothing at all. His coat hung open despite the cold. His simple cotton shirt stretched across shoulders that rippled with muscle as he set her on solid ground and immediately began checking her for injuries with hands that were surprisingly gentle. She couldn't stop staring at him, at the raw power in every movement, at the way he'd torn through an avalanche with his bare hands to reach her, at the concern etched into features that should have been frightening, but somehow weren't. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she couldn't tell if it was from the near-death experience or from the way his hands felt on her arms, steadying her, warming her through the layers of wet wool. "Can you breathe?" His voice was rough, deep, the kind of voice that traveled through a person's chest and settled somewhere low in the belly. She nodded, still unable to form words, and watched as relief flickered across his face. "Good. We need to move. That slide could have been just the first. There's an old cabin down in the ghost town. Can you walk?" She nodded again, and he kept one arm around her waist as he led her down the broken hillside, his body positioned between her and any further danger, moving with a grace that seemed at odds with his size. Behind them, her horse whinnied frantically from where it had somehow avoided the worst of the slide, and he paused long enough to grab its reins and bring it along. Everything he did was efficient, calm, like he'd faced worse than avalanches and survived. The ghost town of Silver Creek lay scattered across the valley floor like broken teeth. Most of its buildings collapsed under the weight of abandonment and weather. But the cabin he led her to still had a roof and walls, and more importantly, it had a fireplace with wood stacked beside it. Within minutes, he had a fire roaring, and Charlotte found herself sitting on an old bench wrapped in his coat, while he tended to her horse outside, making sure the animal was secure for the coming night. Her own coat was soaking wet and useless. When he came back inside, snowflakes catching in his dark hair, she finally found her voice. "You saved my life." The words felt inadequate for what had just happened. He shrugged as he knelt by the fire, adding more wood with practiced movements. "Couldn't exactly leave you buried, could I?" There was something in his tone, a hint of dark humor that made her think he was more accustomed to people leaving him than the other way around. "I'm Charlotte," she said, suddenly aware that she was alone in an abandoned building with a complete stranger who moved like a predator and had the kind of scars on his knuckles that told stories she probably shouldn't want to hear. "Charlotte Brennan, I have a ranch about 10 miles south of here." She was babbling, and she knew it, but the way he looked at her in the firelight made her nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He studied her for a long moment, those dark eyes taking in details she couldn't guess at, and then he gave her a small nod. "Caleb." No last name. No explanation. Just that one word offered like it was all she needed to know. She waited for more, but he turned his attention back to the fire, and she realized that was all she was going to get. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling flames and the wind outside that was picking up as evening approached. She should have been terrified. She was alone with a man who clearly didn't want to share his story, in a ghost town miles from help, with early winter snow starting to fall in earnest outside. But as she watched him work, as she remembered the desperation in his movements when he dug her out, the gentleness in his hands when he checked her for injuries, she found she wasn't afraid at all. If anything, she felt safer than she had in the 3 years since her husband died. And that realization was more terrifying than anything else that had happened today. "The trail's going to be impassable by morning," Caleb said suddenly, his voice breaking through her spiraling thoughts. "That avalanche took out a good section of it, and more snow's coming. We're stuck here until it clears." He didn't look at her when he said it, just kept his eyes on the fire, like he was giving her time to absorb the implications. Stuck. With him. Alone, in a one-room cabin with a single fireplace and no way out. Forced proximity in its purest form. She should protest, should insist on trying to make it back to her ranch tonight. But her children were with her sister-in-law for the week. The ranch hands knew she'd gone into the mountains to check the boundary markers, and wouldn't expect her back until tomorrow anyway. And the truth was that Caleb was right. The trail was gone, and more snow was already falling thick and fast outside the cabin's single window. "All right," she said quietly, pulling his coat tighter around her shoulders. It smelled like pine smoke and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "Then I suppose we'd better figure out how to survive until morning." He finally looked at her then, and something flickered in those dark eyes that might have been approval, or might have been surprise. "You're taking this better than I expected," he said. "Most women would be hysterical by now." She lifted her chin, that old stubborn pride her husband used to tease her about rising up. "I'm a widow running a ranch in Montana Territory. Mr. Caleb, no last name. Hysterics don't keep cattle fed or children clothed. I learned a long time ago that panic is a luxury I can't afford." The corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough, Mrs. Brennan. Fair enough." As darkness fell outside and the temperature dropped, they settled into an uneasy routine. He'd found some old supplies in the cabin, probably left by prospectors or drifters who'd used the place over the years, and managed to heat some water for coffee. It was bitter and weak, but it was warm, and Charlotte wrapped her hands around the tin cup gratefully as she sat closer to the fire. Her dress was still damp in places, and she shivered despite the flames. Caleb noticed, of course, because he seemed to notice everything, and without a word, he draped a dusty old blanket around her shoulders on top of his coat. "You'll catch your death if you don't get warm," he said gruffly, and then he deliberately turned his back to give her privacy while he checked the door and windows, making sure they were secure against the storm. She found herself studying him in the firelight. This stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere to save her life. Everything about him spoke of controlled danger, from the way he moved with predatory grace to the gun belt he wore low on his hips, like it was a natural extension of his body. But there was something else too. Something in the careful way he'd tended to her horse, in the gentle touch of his hands when he'd pulled her from the snow. He was a contradiction, this man. All hard edges wrapped around something softer that he tried to hide. She wondered what his story was, what had brought him to an abandoned ghost town in Montana Territory in early winter, why he'd given her only his first name, what he was running from, because men who moved like that were always running from something. "You're staring," he said without turning around, and she felt heat-fluttered cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I was just thinking that I should thank you properly. You risked your life to save mine. I don't even know how to begin repaying that debt." He did turn then, and there was something in his expression that was almost sad. "No debt, Mrs. Brennan. Any decent person would have done the same." But she shook her head, because she'd known plenty of so-called decent people in her life. And she doubted many of them would have torn through an avalanche with their bare hands for a stranger. "I don't think that's true," she said softly. "But thank you anyway, for being the kind of man who would." The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid, and Charlotte found herself unable to look away from him. There was something about this moment, about being trapped together in this small cabin while the storm raged outside, that felt suspended in time, like the rest of the world had ceased to exist and there was only this, the fire, the snow, and the two of them breathing the same air in the flickering darkness. She should be thinking about getting home, about her children and her ranch, and all the responsibilities waiting for her. Instead, all she could think about was the way his hands had felt pulling her up through the snow, and the way her heart still hadn't quite settled back to its normal rhythm. "You should try to sleep," Caleb said finally, breaking the spell. "I'll keep the fire going and keep watch. Storm like this, you never know what might decide to seek shelter." She wanted to argue, to insist that she could take a watch too, but exhaustion was pulling at her bones, and her body was finally warming up enough for her to realize how utterly drained she felt. So she curled up on the bench wrapped in his coat and the blanket, using her saddlebag as a pillow, and closed her eyes. But sleep was a long time coming, because she was achingly aware of every sound he made, every shift of his body as he sat by the fire feeding wood to the flames. And when she finally did drift off, her dreams were full of dark eyes and strong hands, and the memory of being pulled up into the light. She woke to pale gray light filtering through the window and the smell of something cooking. For a moment, Charlotte was disoriented, expecting to see her bedroom at the ranch. But then the events of yesterday came flooding back, and she sat up quickly, her neck protesting the awkward angle she'd slept in. Caleb was crouched by the fire, and impossibly, he'd found eggs somewhere and was cooking them in an old iron skillet. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Found a few things cached in a corner. Probably supplies someone left meaning to come back for. Figure they won't mind us borrowing them given the circumstances." She pushed her hair back from her face, suddenly aware that she must look a fright, and tried to smooth her wrinkled dress. "How long have you been awake?" she asked. He shrugged. "Never really slept. Someone had to keep watch." Which meant he'd sat up all night, feeding the fire and making sure she stayed warm and safe. The realization made something twist in her chest. The eggs were barely seasoned and cooked in too much lard, but they were the best things she'd tasted in months. They ate in companionable silence, and then Caleb went outside to check on the horse and assess the snow situation. When he came back, his expression was grim. "Still coming down heavy," he reported, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Trail's buried. We're not going anywhere today. Maybe not tomorrow either. You got people who'll worry?" She thought of her sister-in-law and the children, but Margaret knew she'd planned to be gone for a few days checking the far boundaries. They wouldn't start worrying for at least another 2 days. "Not immediately," she said. "You?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "No one who'll care." There was a world of loneliness in those 4 words, and Charlotte felt her heartache, for reasons she didn't fully understand. The day stretched long and strange. They were trapped together in a space barely bigger than her kitchen, forced into an intimacy that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Caleb checked the cabin thoroughly, shoring up weak spots in the walls, making sure the chimney was drawing properly. She organized the meager supplies, took inventory of what they had versus what they might need if they were stuck here longer than expected. They worked around each other with surprising ease, and Charlotte caught herself watching him more than she should, noticing the way his muscles moved under his shirt when he lifted wood, the concentration on his face when he worked, the unconscious grace in every movement. "You're good with your hands," she said at one point, watching him repair a loose board in the wall, and then immediately felt her face flush at how that sounded. He glanced at her with something that might have been amusement. "Learned young," he said simply. "Had to. No one else was going to fix things for me." There was a story there, she could tell. Something about his past that had shaped him into the self-sufficient man he was now. She wanted to ask, wanted to know everything about him, but she held her tongue. He'd given her his first name, and nothing more, and she had to respect that boundary even as curiosity ate at her. That afternoon, restless from being cooped up, Caleb ventured out to hunt. He came back an hour later with 2 rabbits, and Charlotte found herself genuinely impressed. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Caleb," she said as she helped him prepare them for cooking. He worked with a knife like he'd been born with one in his hand, quick and efficient and utterly confident. "Spent some time living off the land," he said. "You learn, or you starve." She wondered again what his story was, what had driven him to live rough like that. But instead of asking, she focused on helping, and together they made a stew that filled the cabin with rich, savory smells. It was the most domestic thing she'd done with a man since her husband died, and the ease of it surprised her. With Thomas, there had always been an edge, a need to prove herself capable. With Caleb, there was just work that needed doing, and they did it together, without fuss. That evening, fed and warm, they sat on opposite sides of the fire and actually talked. Real conversation, not just practical exchanges about survival. She told him about her ranch, about her children, Emma, who was 7, and Samuel, who was 5, about how hard it had been learning to run things alone after Thomas died in a logging accident 3 years ago. "I didn't know anything about ranching," she admitted. "I was a merchant's daughter from Virginia. Thomas brought me out here with dreams of making our fortune, and then he was just gone. And suddenly I was responsible for everything. The hands didn't want to take orders from a woman. The bank didn't want to extend credit to a widow. I had to fight for every inch of respect I've got." Caleb listened without interrupting, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. And when she finished, he nodded slowly. "But you did it," he said. "You fought and you won." She smiled a little. "I'm still fighting. But yes, I suppose I did." She wanted to ask about him, about his life. But before she could form the question, he stood and moved to the window, staring out at the falling snow. The set of his shoulders told her the conversation was over, that he'd given her his attention, and now he was retreating back behind whatever walls kept him safe. She should have been frustrated, but instead, she found herself wondering what wounds he was protecting, what pain he carried that made him guard himself so carefully. That night, when she lay down to sleep again, she was more aware than ever of his presence, of the way he kept watch through the dark hours, a silent guardian against whatever dangers the wilderness might hold. The third day dawned clear and cold. The snow had finally stopped, and the world outside was transformed into a pristine white wilderness that sparkled in the sunlight. Caleb went out early to check the trail situation and came back with better news. "It's passable if we're careful," he said. "Probably take twice as long as it should. But we can get you home today if we leave soon." She should have been relieved, should have been eager to get back to her children and her life. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment. These 3 days trapped together had been strange and intense and completely unexpected. And the thought of going back to reality, of this ending, left her feeling oddly hollow. They packed up in silence, erasing any trace of their presence in the cabin out of some unspoken agreement to leave it as they'd found it for the next person who might need shelter. Charlotte folded his coat carefully and held it out to him. "Thank you," she said. "For everything, for saving me, for keeping me safe, for..." She didn't know how to finish that sentence. For making her feel things she hadn't felt in years. For reminding her that there were good men in the world. For 3 days that had somehow changed something fundamental inside her. He took the coat, their fingers brushing for just a moment, and she felt that touch all the way to her bones. "You're welcome, Mrs. Brennan," he said quietly. Then he saddled her horse, and they set out into the brilliant morning, following the snow-covered trail back toward civilization. The journey was slow and careful, just as he'd predicted. In places, they had to lead the horse on foot, testing each step to make sure the ground was solid. Caleb moved ahead of her, blazing a trail, his body positioned to catch her if she slipped. Every so often, he'd look back to make sure she was all right, and each time their eyes met, Charlotte felt that same jolt of connection that had been building over the past 3 days. This was more than gratitude, more than the natural bond between two people who'd survived something together. This was dangerous territory, and she knew it, but she couldn't seem to make herself care. When they finally reached the boundary of her ranch in late afternoon, she could see her ranch house in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney. One of the hands must have come back early to check on things. The sight of home should have filled her with relief, but instead, she felt a growing sense of loss. This was where they parted ways, where Caleb disappeared back into whatever life he'd come from, and she returned to hers, and these 3 days became just a strange memory. She reined in her horse and turned to him, words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Stay," she said. "Come to the house. Let me feed you properly. It's the least I can do." He shook his head before she even finished. "I can't, Mrs. Brennan. I appreciate the offer, but I've got somewhere I need to be." The lie was obvious in the stiffness of his shoulders, in the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes. "Where?" she challenged. "Where do you have to be that's more important than a hot meal and a warm bed? Where are you running to, Caleb?" He flinched at that last question, and she knew she'd struck a nerve. "Not running to," he said quietly. "Running from, and the longer I stay in one place, the more danger I bring to the people around me." Her breath caught. "What kind of danger?" He finally looked at her then. Really looked at her. And the pain in his eyes made her chest ache. The kind that gets good people hurt. The kind that ruins lives. "I'm not what you think I am, Charlotte. I'm not some hero who saved you out of nobility. I'm just a man trying to atone for mistakes. And the best thing I can do for you is disappear before I drag you into my mess." She stared at him, her mind racing. 3 days together, and he'd never once made her feel unsafe. Never once treated her with anything but respect and care. Whatever he thought he was, whatever mistakes he'd made, she couldn't reconcile them with the man who dug her out of an avalanche and kept watch over her sleep and taught her children's names to his horse so he'd remember them in conversation. "I don't believe you're a bad man," she said firmly. He smiled, but it was sad and bitter. "You don't know me well enough to make that judgment." Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was pure Old West courtesy and turned his horse away. "Safe journey home, Mrs. Brennan. Take care of those children of yours." She watched him ride away, her throat tight with emotions she didn't understand and didn't want to name. He got maybe 50 yards before she called out, her voice carrying across the snowy field. "Caleb!" He stopped, but didn't turn around. She nudged her horse forward until she was alongside him, and then she reached out and gripped his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the fabric of his coat. "If you're ever in trouble," she said intensely, "if you ever need help or a place to go, you come to me. You understand? You saved my life. That means something. It means you've got a friend, whether you want one or not." He looked down at her hand on his arm, and something flickered across his face that might have been longing, or might have been regret. "You don't owe me anything," he said roughly. "Yes, I do," she countered. "And more than that, I want to. So promise me. Promise you'll remember that you've got somewhere safe if you need it." For a long moment, he didn't answer, and she thought he'd refuse. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll remember," he said quietly. "Thank you, Charlotte." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and hearing it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. Then he did ride away for real, disappearing into the trees at the edge of her property, and she was left sitting on her horse in the snow, wondering what had just happened, and why it felt like she'd just lost something important before she'd even had a chance to understand what it was. The next few weeks passed in a blur of ordinary ranch life. Her children came home from their aunt's house full of stories and energy, and she threw herself into the work of preparing for deeper winter, checking the cattle, repairing fences, laying in supplies. She should have been happy to be back in her routine, back to the life she'd fought so hard to build. Instead, she found herself distracted, her mind wandering to a cabin in a ghost town, and a man with dark eyes who'd kept watch while she slept. Emma noticed, of course, because 7-year-old girls noticed everything. "Mama, "Why do you keep looking at the mountains?" she asked one afternoon. Charlotte forced a smile. "Just checking the weather, sweetheart. Making sure there's no more snow coming." But that wasn't the truth, and she knew it. She was looking for a rider who wouldn't come. For a man who'd made it clear he didn't belong in her life. Then one morning, about 3 weeks after the avalanche, one of her ranch hands rode in with news that made her blood run cold. "There's wanted posters up in Silver Creek," Jack said, his weathered face concerned. "For some outlaw name of Caleb Morgan. Says he killed a man in Colorado and stole a mining payroll. $500 reward." Charlotte's heart stopped. Morgan. Caleb Morgan. The man who'd saved her life was wanted for murder and theft. Her hands trembled as she took the poster Jack had brought back, staring at the crude sketch that looked nothing like the real man, but somehow captured something of his intensity. The charges were serious. Murder. Robbery. If he was caught, he'd hang. But as she read the details more carefully, something didn't add up. The crime had supposedly happened in Colorado 3 months ago, but the description of events felt wrong somehow, like pieces that didn't quite fit together. And more than that, she couldn't reconcile the man described in the poster, cold-blooded and ruthless, with the man who gently checked her for injuries and sat up all night to keep her warm. Her instincts, honed by 3 years of running a ranch and learning to judge character quickly, told her there was more to this story than the poster revealed. She thought about what he'd said when he left. "I'm just a man trying to atone for mistakes, not running from crimes." Trying to atone. There was a difference. "Jack," she said slowly, "did you hear any talk in town about this? Any details beyond what's on the poster?" The older man scratched his jaw thoughtfully. "Well, now that you mention it, there was some talk. Seems the man who's pushing for the arrest is Marcus Dalton. Runs the big mining operation over in Colorado. But there's folks who say Dalton's as crooked as they come, that he's been known to frame people who get in his way. Of course, that's just talk. Can't say for certain." Marcus Dalton. The name meant nothing to Charlotte, but it clearly meant something to someone, and if there were rumors about his character, then maybe, just maybe, Caleb wasn't guilty of what they said he'd done. She spent the rest of the day trying to work, but her mind kept circling back to the poster, to Caleb's face when he'd said he was running from something, to the way he'd tensed when she'd asked where he was going. He was in danger. Real danger. And if the law caught up with him before the truth came out, if there even was a truth beyond what the poster claimed, he'd die. The thought made her feel physically ill. That night, after the children were in bed, she sat by her own fireplace, staring into the flames, and thought about debts and promises, and what it meant to call someone a friend. The next morning, Charlotte made a decision. She called Jack into her kitchen and asked him to watch the ranch and the children for a few days. "I need to go to Silver Creek," she said. "Maybe over to Colorado if I have to. There's something I need to look into." Jack's weathered face creased with concern. "Mrs. Brennan, if this is about that outlaw," she held up a hand. "He saved my life, Jack. I owe him at least the effort to find out the truth. And if I'm wrong, if he really is what they say he is, then I need to know that too." The old ranch hand studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You're as stubborn as your late husband, you know that? All right, I'll watch the place. But you be careful. Truth or lies, wanted men attract dangerous attention. She packed light and rode out before dawn, before the children could wake and ask questions she didn't want to answer. The journey to Silver Creek took most of the day, and by the time she arrived, the sun was setting, and the small frontier town was settling into evening routines. She went straight to the sheriff's office, where a tired-looking man in his 50s looked up from paperwork with mild surprise. "Help you, ma'am?" Charlotte pulled out the wanted poster. "I want to know more about this man, about what he supposedly did." The sheriff, whose nameplate read Sheriff William Tucker, leaned back in his chair. "That's Marcus Dalton's business mostly. Man named Caleb Morgan allegedly killed Dalton's foreman and made off with 3 months' worth of payroll. Dalton's been pushing hard for someone to bring him in, dead or alive." "Allegedly," Charlotte repeated, catching the word. "You sound uncertain, Sheriff." Tucker's expression became guarded. "I'm a lawman, Mrs. Brennan. I deal in evidence and witnesses, not gossip. The evidence says Morgan's guilty, but there was something in his tone that made her press harder. What does the gossip say?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing his words carefully. Finally, he sighed. "Off the record, Dalton's been accused before of making people who cross him disappear one way or another. There's been 3 men in the past 2 years who stood up to him about working conditions or pay, and all 3 ended up dead or run out of the territory under mysterious circumstances. But proving it is another matter entirely. The man's got money and influence, and he knows how to cover his tracks." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "So you think Morgan might be innocent?" Tucker held up his hands. "I think the law says he's wanted, and unless someone can prove otherwise, that's what I have to go by. Now, you mind telling me why a respectable ranch widow is asking detailed questions about a wanted outlaw?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because he pulled me out of an avalanche 3 weeks ago and saved my life. Because I spent 3 days with him, and he never once gave me reason to fear him. Because the man I met doesn't match the man in that poster, and I need to know which one is real." The sheriff's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a story, Mrs. Brennan." She lifted her chin. "It's the truth, Sheriff. Every word." Tucker studied her with shrewd eyes, and she got the sense he was reevaluating her, seeing past the proper widow facade to the determination beneath. "All right," he said slowly. "I'll tell you what I know, but you didn't hear it from me. The foreman who died, a man named Pete Sanderson, was found shot in his office. The payroll was gone. Morgan was seen riding away from the mine that night. That's the evidence. But here's what doesn't sit right with me. Sanderson was known to be working on some kind of investigation into Dalton's books. Had mentioned to folks he'd found discrepancies. Then suddenly, he's dead. The payroll's gone. And Dalton's pointing the finger at Morgan, who'd only been working there a few weeks. Convenient, if you ask me." "Where can I find Marcus Dalton?" Charlotte asked. Tucker's face went stern. "Now hold on, Mrs. Brennan. You can't just go confronting a man like that. He's dangerous, and if he is behind this, the last thing you want is to get on his radar." But she'd already made up her mind. "I need to hear his side. Need to understand what really happened. If Caleb Morgan is innocent, someone has to speak up for him." The sheriff sighed heavily. "You're determined to do this?" She nodded. "Then at least let me send a telegram to the marshal in Colorado. See if there's been any new developments. Might save you a dangerous trip. Come back tomorrow morning." That night, Charlotte took a room at the small boarding house and lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She kept seeing Caleb's face in the firelight, kept remembering the gentleness in his hands and the pain in his eyes when he'd said he was running from something. If Dalton had framed him, if Caleb was innocent and running because he had no way to prove it, then he was out there alone, hunted, with winter closing in and nowhere safe to go. The thought made her chest ache. She'd lost her husband to senseless tragedy. She couldn't stand by and let an innocent man hang for a crime he didn't commit, not when she had the means to at least try to help. Morning came cold and clear. Charlotte was at the sheriff's office when Tucker arrived, and the look on his face told her he had news. "Got a response from Marshal Henderson in Colorado," he said, holding up a telegram. "Interesting developments. Turns out Pete Sanderson left a letter with his wife before he died. Told her to open it if anything happened to him. She finally worked up the courage to take it to the marshal last week. In it, Sanderson detailed evidence of embezzlement by Marcus Dalton. Said Dalton had been skimming from the payroll for months and cooking the books to hide it. Said he was planning to confront Dalton with the evidence." Tucker's expression was grim. "Marshall's investigating now, but it paints a different picture of that night, doesn't it?" Charlotte's heart raced. "So Caleb might be innocent?" Tucker nodded slowly. "Might be. Or might be he was working with Dalton and double-crossed him. Or might be he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Dalton used him as a scapegoat. Point is, there's enough question now that the marshal's holding off on the hanging part of that warrant until he investigates further. Still wants Morgan brought in for questioning, but at least now he's got a chance at a fair hearing." Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. "I need to find him," she said. "Need to tell him there's hope, that he can clear his name." Tucker's expression turned worried. "Mrs. Brennan, even with this new information, Morgan's still a wanted man. If you're found helping him—" "I don't care," she interrupted. "He saved my life, Sheriff. I won't abandon him now." Tucker was quiet for a moment. Then he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a rough map. "All right," he said quietly. "But you didn't get this from me. There's a trapper who comes through here sometimes. Old fellow named Red John. He mentioned seeing a campsite up in the high country about 2 weeks ago. Said whoever was there was living rough and avoiding trails. Could be Morgan, could be someone else. But if you were looking for a man who didn't want to be found, that's where I'd start." He marked a spot on the map with his pencil. "It's a hard ride, especially with snow. You sure about this?" Charlotte studied the map, committing the location to memory. "I'm sure," she said firmly. She bought supplies in town, being careful to look like she was just stocking up for winter, and then she rode out heading east like she was going home. Once she was out of sight of Silver Creek, she turned north toward the high country Tucker had marked. The journey was treacherous, the trails barely passable with early winter snow, but she'd grown up learning to ride, and 3 years of ranch work had made her tough. She pushed on through the afternoon, following game trails and instinct, heading toward the remote areas where a man could disappear if he knew what he was doing. She made camp that night in a small hollow, sheltered by rocks, building a tiny fire just large enough to warm some food. The wilderness felt immense around her, empty and cold, and for the first time she let herself wonder if she was crazy for doing this. What if Caleb didn't want to be found? What if he was guilty after all, and she was riding into danger? But then she remembered his eyes in the firelight, the care in his hands, and she knew she had to try. The next morning dawned gray and threatening more snow. She rode higher into the mountains, following the landmarks Tucker had described, and by midday she found signs that someone had been through recently. Tracks in the snow, carefully concealed but visible if you knew what to look for. A cold campfire hidden in a rocky overhang. She was getting close. That afternoon, as she navigated through a narrow ravine, a voice called out from above her. "That's far enough, Mrs. Brennan." She looked up, and there he was, standing on a rocky outcrop above her, rifle in hand. Caleb looked thinner than she remembered, harder, like the weeks on the run had worn him down to pure survival instinct. But his eyes were the same, those dark eyes with amber flecks that had haunted her dreams. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough. She dismounted and looked up at him, tilting her head back so he could see her face clearly. "I know about Colorado," she called up. "I know about Dalton and the foreman and the embezzlement. I know you're innocent." She saw the shock ripple across his face, quickly hidden but not fast enough. "You don't know anything," he said, but there was no conviction in his words. "I know enough," she countered, "and I know the marshal in Colorado is investigating now, that there's a chance to clear your name if you'll come in and tell your side of the story." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and then he lowered the rifle and climbed down from the outcrop with that predatory grace she remembered. When he reached the bottom, he stood a few feet away from her, and she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the weight of weeks spent running. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why did you go looking into this? Why risk yourself coming up here?" "Because you saved my life," she said. "Because I spent 3 days with you and I know you're not a killer. Because I made you promise to come to me if you needed help, but you're too stubborn to ask, so I came to you instead." Something flickered in his expression. Something that might have been hope, or might have been pain. "Charlotte, even if what you're saying is true, even if there's a chance to clear my name, you shouldn't be involved in this. Dalton is dangerous. If he finds out you're helping me..." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "I'm not afraid of Marcus Dalton, and I'm not leaving you up here to freeze or starve because you're too proud to accept help." He stared down at her, and she saw the moment his defenses started to crack. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish," he said quietly. She smiled. Maybe both. For the first time since she'd met him, Caleb actually smiled back. A real smile that transformed his face and made him look younger, less haunted. "Both," he agreed. Then his expression grew serious again. "All right, tell me everything you learned." They moved to his camp, a carefully concealed site in a rocky shelter where he'd set up a minimal existence. As she told him about her conversation with Sheriff Tucker and the telegram from the marshal, she watched the hope grow in his eyes, tempered by caution born of hard experience. "Sanderson was a good man," Caleb said when she finished. "He figured out what Dalton was doing and told me about it. Asked if I'd be willing to testify if needed, since I'd seen some of the discrepancies too. I agreed. Then 2 days later, Sanderson was dead, and I woke up to find myself being framed for murder and theft I didn't commit." "Why didn't you stay and fight the charges?" Charlotte asked. He laughed bitterly. "With what? I'm nobody, Charlotte. A drifter working odd jobs trying to make enough to buy a piece of land somewhere. Dalton has money, influence, the mining company behind him. He had witnesses who swore they saw me leaving Sanderson's office that night. Never mind that those witnesses were his men, and would say whatever he paid them to say. I knew if I stayed, I'd hang. So I ran. Figured at least running gave me a chance, even if it meant living like this. He gestured at the bare camp, and she saw the resignation in his face. This wasn't living. This was just surviving day to day with no hope for better. You don't have to run anymore, she said firmly. Come back to Silver Creek with me. Talk to Sheriff Tucker. He'll telegraph the marshal and arrange for you to come in safely, with protection until the investigation is complete. Caleb shook his head. You're asking me to trust the law when the law has wanted me dead for 3 months. She understood his fear, could see it in the tension of his shoulders. But she also knew this wasn't sustainable. Winter was deepening. Eventually, the cold or the hunger or the isolation would kill him. Or someone hunting that bounty would find him. Then trust me, she said, reaching out to touch his arm. I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it. The touch seemed to undo something in him. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and when he raised his eyes to hers, they were full of an emotion she couldn't quite name. Why? He asked again, his voice rough. Why would you risk so much for me? You barely know me. She smiled sadly. I know enough. I know you kept me safe when I was vulnerable. I know you sat up all night to make sure I stayed warm. I know you could have taken advantage of me in that cabin, and you never once made me feel unsafe. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. She paused, then added more quietly. And maybe I'm tired of good men suffering while bad men prosper. Maybe I want to believe the truth can still win sometimes. They talked for hours as darkness fell, and Caleb built up the fire. He told her everything about that night in Colorado. Every detail he remembered, and she listened carefully, filing away information that might help clear his name. The more he talked, the more certain she became that he was telling the truth. There was too much detail, too much genuine anger at the injustice, for it to be a fabrication. When he finally fell silent, she made her decision. Tomorrow, we ride to Silver Creek together, she said. We talk to Sheriff Tucker, we send word to the marshal, and we start fighting this the right way. With truth and evidence, not by running. Caleb looked at her across the fire, and she saw a battle playing out behind his eyes. Fear warring with hope, distrust of the system warring with exhaustion from running. If I do this, he said slowly, if I come in and it goes wrong, if Dalton's influence reaches far enough to see me hang anyway, I need you to promise me something. Charlotte's throat tightened. What? His dark eyes held hers with fierce intensity. Promise me you'll go back to your ranch and your children and forget you ever knew me. Promise me you won't let any of this touch your life. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him there was no way she could forget him. But she could see how much he needed to hear this, so she nodded, even though she knew it was a lie. I promise, she said softly. Though I don't think I'll need to keep that promise. I think you're going to clear your name and get your life back. He smiled at her optimism, but it was tinged with sadness. You have more faith in justice than I do. She smiled back. Then, I'll have enough faith for both of us." They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down. Charlotte should have felt the impropriety of being alone with him again, unchaperoned in the wilderness. But just like in the ghost town cabin, she felt only safe, only seen and understood in a way she hadn't experienced in years. When it came time to sleep, Caleb gave her his bedroll and took watch position like he had before, a guardian against the darkness. And just like before, she fell asleep aware of every breath he took, every shift of his body, feeling protected and cherished in a way that terrified her with its intensity. The ride down the mountain the next morning was tense. Caleb was hyper-alert, his hand never far from his gun, scanning the landscape constantly for threats. But they made it to Silver Creek without incident, arriving in late afternoon. Charlotte led him directly to Sheriff Tucker's office, where the lawman's eyes widened at the sight of the wanted man walking in voluntarily. "Don't reach for that gun, Sheriff," Caleb said calmly, his hands visible and empty. "Mrs. Brennan convinced me to come in peacefully. I'm told you've been in contact with Marshal Henderson about new evidence in my case." Tucker's hand had indeed moved toward his gun belt, but he stopped at Caleb's words, his sharp eyes taking in the situation. "She told you about Sanderson's letter?" Caleb nodded. "And I'm ready to tell my side of what happened that night, if you're willing to listen before you lock me up." Over the next hour, Caleb laid out everything he knew about the discrepancies in the payroll he'd noticed, about Sanderson confiding in him, about agreeing to testify if needed, about finding Sanderson's body and realizing immediately he was being set up. "I panicked," he admitted. "I should have stayed and fought, but I'd seen what Dalton did to people who crossed him. I knew I didn't have money for a lawyer, didn't have connections. All I had was my word against his, and his was backed by gold." Tucker listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, and when Caleb finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair. "That matches what Sanderson's widow told the marshal," he said finally. "And it fits with what Henderson's been uncovering about Dalton's finances. But you understand, I still have to hold you until the marshal can get here and sort this out officially." Caleb nodded, resignation in his face. "I understand." Charlotte spoke up, her voice firm. "Then I'm posting bail, whatever it costs." Tucker shook his head. "Can't offer bail on a murder charge, Mrs. Brennan. Even with the investigation ongoing, he's still officially wanted." She felt panic rise in her chest. "So you're just going to lock him in a cell where Dalton can get to him? Where anyone hunting that bounty can?" The sheriff held up a hand. "Easy now. I'm not saying he goes in the public cell. I've got a back room, secure but more comfortable, and I won't be advertising that he's here. Far as anyone needs to know, I'm holding a prisoner in connection with the Colorado investigation. No names given. That should buy us time for the marshal to arrive and take him into protective custody. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing." Charlotte watched as Tucker led Caleb to the back room, which was indeed more comfortable than a cell, with a real bed and a window, though the door still locked from the outside. Before Tucker closed the door, Caleb looked at Charlotte, and the gratitude in his eyes made her throat tight. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything. Whatever happens from here, you gave me a chance I wouldn't have had otherwise." She wanted to say so much more, wanted to tell him this wasn't over, that she'd fight for him every step of the way. But Tucker was waiting, and the moment passed. "I'll be back tomorrow," she said instead. You're not alone in this, Caleb. Remember that. That night, Charlotte took a room at the boarding house again, but couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jump. Every creak of the building made her imagine someone coming for Caleb. She trusted Tucker to keep him safe. But trust only went so far when there was a $500 bounty on a man's head and corruption at play. She lay in the darkness and thought about how quickly her life had changed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been buried in an avalanche. Now she was invested in the fate of an accused outlaw, risking her reputation and possibly her safety to help clear his name. Her sister-in-law would think she'd lost her mind. The town gossips would have a field day. But none of that mattered as much as making sure an innocent man didn't hang. The next morning brought unexpected news. Tucker met her at his office door with a grim expression. "Dalton's here," he said quietly. "Arrived about an hour ago with 2 of his men. Says he heard rumors Morgan might be in the area and came to make sure justice is served." Charlotte's blood ran cold. "You didn't tell him?" Tucker shook his head quickly. "I told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any wanted men, that if Morgan was smart he'd be in Mexico by now." Dalton seemed to accept that, but he's taking rooms at the hotel and says he's staying a few days to look around. "We need to be very careful, Mrs. Brennan. That man is dangerous, and if he figures out Morgan's here..." Charlotte's mind raced. They needed to get word to the marshal faster, needed to move Caleb somewhere safer, needed something to shift the situation in their favor. "Let me talk to Dalton," she said suddenly. Tucker's eyebrows shot up. That's a bad idea. But she'd already made up her mind. "He doesn't know who I am, doesn't know I'm involved. Let me see what I can learn. What kind of man he really is. Maybe he'll let something slip that helps the case." The sheriff looked deeply unhappy, but after a moment he nodded reluctantly. "All right, but you be careful, and if he even hints at a threat, you get out of there immediately." She found Marcus Dalton at the hotel, a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and cold blue eyes that assessed her the moment she approached. "Mr. Dalton," she said, putting on her most harmless widow voice. "I'm Charlotte Brennan. I own a ranch south of here. I heard you were looking for information about the outlaw Caleb Morgan." Dalton's expression became attentive. "I am, Mrs. Brennan. Do you have information?" She nodded, weaving truth and fiction together. "I may have seen someone matching his description a few weeks back, up in the mountains near the old ghost town. I was checking boundary markers and saw a man camping rough. Didn't think much of it at the time, but when I saw the wanted poster in town yesterday, I wondered if it might have been him." Dalton leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Can you describe this man?" She gave a vague description that could have fit a dozen men, carefully not providing anything too specific. "He was alone. Seemed to be heading east when I saw him. This was about 3 weeks ago, so he could be long gone by now." Dalton sat back, clearly calculating. 3 weeks. He could have made it to Dakota Territory by now, or doubled back. "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Brennan. If you see or hear anything else, I trust you'll report it immediately. There's a substantial reward for information leading to his capture." Unquote. The way he said it made her skin crawl, like he was discussing hunting an animal rather than bringing a man to justice. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Might I ask, Mr. Dalton, what exactly did this man do? The poster says murder and theft, but I've heard there might be more to the story." It was a risk, pushing for information, but she wanted to see his reaction. Dalton's expression hardened. He murdered my foreman in cold blood and stole 3 months of payroll. Pete Sanderson was a good man, and Morgan killed him for money. There's nothing more to the story than that. But Charlotte had spent 3 years learning to read men in business negotiations, learning to spot lies and half-truths, and something in Dalton's tone rang false. He was too emphatic, too insistent, like he was trying to convince himself as much as her. She excused herself politely and went directly back to Tucker's office, her heart pounding. "He's lying," she told the sheriff. "I don't know how I know, but I know." The way he talked about Sanderson, about the crime, it was too rehearsed. Like he's told the story so many times he almost believes it himself. Tucker nodded slowly. That fits with what the marshal's been finding. But knowing someone's lying and proving it in court are two different things. We need Dalton to slip up, to reveal something concrete. Charlotte thought about the situation, turning pieces over in her mind like a puzzle. "What if we made him think Caleb escaped?" she said slowly. "What if we forced his hand, made him panic and act rashly?" Tucker looked skeptical. "That's a dangerous game, Mrs. Brennan. If Dalton thinks Morgan's loose, he might do something desperate." But Charlotte's mind was working faster now, seeing possibilities. Exactly. Right now he's in control, watching and waiting. But if he thinks he's losing his chance to silence the one person who can expose him, he might reveal himself, might contact his men, say something incriminating where the wrong person could overhear. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. "It could work, but we'd need to protect Morgan for real. Get him somewhere Dalton can't actually reach him even if he tries. And you'd need to be nowhere near any of this when it goes down. Too dangerous." They spent the next hour planning. Tucker would spread word quietly that his prisoner had overpowered him and escaped during the night. He'd make a show of forming a search party. Meanwhile, Caleb would actually be moved to the abandoned line shack on Charlotte's ranch, the one farthest from the main house where no one would think to look. Tucker would position deputies watching Dalton, ready to follow if he made a move. It was risky, but it might be the only way to get the evidence they needed to clear Caleb's name for good. Charlotte rode back to her ranch that afternoon to prepare the line shack, making sure it was stocked with supplies and wood for the fire. Her ranch hands thought she was just doing routine winter preparation, and she didn't correct them. That night, under cover of darkness, Tucker brought Caleb out to the ranch himself. Charlotte met them at the line shack, a simple one-room building half a mile from the main house. "You'll be safe here," she told Caleb as Tucker left to return to town. "My hands know to stay away from this shack in winter unless I specifically send them. You'll have food, warmth, and privacy while we wait for Dalton to make his move." Caleb looked around the small space, then back at her, and she saw the conflict in his face. "This is too much risk for you," he said. "If anyone finds out you're hiding me," she cut him off, "then they find out. I'm not afraid, Caleb. And I'm not letting you face this alone." They stood in the small space, the air between them charged with everything unspoken. Finally, Caleb reached out and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers trailing along her cheek. "You're an extraordinary woman, Charlotte Brennan," he said softly. "Your husband was a lucky man." Her breath caught at the touch, at the intensity in his dark eyes. "He was a good man," she said, "but he never looked at me the way you do." The words hung in the air between them. An admission of something they'd both been dancing around since the avalanche. Caleb's hand stilled against her face. "How do I look at you?" he asked, his voice rough. She swallowed hard. "Like I matter. Like you see me, not just the widow or the ranch owner or the mother. Like you see Charlotte, the woman underneath all those roles." He moved closer, so close she could feel the heat of his body, could see the way his pupils dilated in the lamplight. "I do see you," he said. "I see your courage and your kindness and your strength. I see how hard you fight for what's right, even when it costs you. I see everything, Charlotte, and it terrifies me because I have no right to want you the way I do." Her heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe. "What if I want you to want me?" she whispered. "What if I'm tired of doing the proper thing and just want to feel alive again?" For a moment, she thought he'd kiss her. She saw the desire flame in his eyes, saw his gaze drop to her lips. But then he stepped back, his jaw clenched with visible effort. "You deserve better than an outlaw who might hang," he said roughly. "You deserve someone who can give you a future, not someone who's fighting just to survive." The rejection stung, but she understood it. He was trying to protect her, trying to do the honorable thing, even though it cost him. "What if I get to decide what I deserve?" she said quietly. "What if I choose you?" He closed his eyes like her words hurt him physically. "Don't," he said. "Don't choose me until you know I'm free. Don't make promises you might regret when this is all over." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she'd already made her choice the moment she'd ridden into the mountains looking for him. But she could see he needed this boundary, this last piece of control, in a situation where he had so little. So she nodded, even though it killed her. "All right," she said. "I'll wait. But Caleb, when you're cleared, when this is over and you're free, we're having this conversation again. And I won't accept noble self-sacrifice as an answer." Despite himself, he smiled. "Is that a promise or a threat?" She smiled back. "Both." The next morning, word spread through Silver Creek that the prisoner had escaped. Tucker played his part perfectly, organizing search parties and looking suitably frustrated. Charlotte watched from town as Dalton received the news, saw the flash of anger cross his face before he controlled it. He immediately sent one of his men riding hard out of town, presumably to send a telegram or alert others. Tucker's deputy followed discreetly. By evening, they had intercepted a telegram Dalton had sent to someone in Colorado. "Morgan escaped. Find him before he talks. Use any means necessary." It wasn't quite a confession, but it was close. It showed Dalton was worried about what Caleb might say, implied there was something to hide. Tucker sent it immediately to the marshal, along with a request for urgent assistance. "Henderson says he can be here in 3 days," Tucker told Charlotte. "Said to keep Morgan hidden and safe until then. He's bringing a federal judge and enough evidence to arrest Dalton if we can connect him directly to the threats against Morgan." 3 days. They just had to keep Caleb safe for 3 more days. Charlotte rode back to the ranch and brought Caleb the news, watching relief and lingering tension war in his expression. 3 days, he repeated. "And then what? Even if they arrest Dalton, his lawyers will fight. This could drag on for months." "Then it drags on for months," Charlotte said firmly. "But you'll be alive and free to fight it. Not running or dead. That's what matters." They fell into an uneasy routine over those 3 days. Charlotte would ride out to the line shack morning and evening, bringing food and news and just keeping him company. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told him about her children, about her dreams for the ranch, about her life before Montana. He told her about his childhood, about losing his parents young and making his own way, about the dreams he'd had of owning land before everything fell apart. Each conversation brought them closer, built understanding and intimacy in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with genuine connection. On the second night, as they sat by the fire in the line shack, Caleb suddenly said, "Tell me about your husband, about what your marriage was like." Charlotte was surprised by the question, but found herself answering honestly. "Thomas was a good provider and a good father," she said slowly. "But we married young, me barely 18, and I think we grew into different people than either of us expected. He loved Montana, loved the adventure of building something from nothing. I loved him and tried to love what he loved, but there was always a distance between us, like we were partners in building a life, but not quite partners in living it. Does that make sense?" Caleb nodded, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. "It makes perfect sense. Sometimes people fit together in practical ways, but not in the ways that matter most." She looked at him across the small space. "What about you? Has there ever been anyone?" He was quiet for a long moment, then shook his head. "Never stayed anywhere long enough. Never had anything stable enough to offer someone. And after a while, I just accepted that maybe I wasn't meant for that kind of life. That maybe I was the kind of man who was supposed to walk alone." The loneliness in his voice made her chest ache. "That's not true," she said softly. "You're not meant to be alone, Caleb. You're meant to be with someone who sees you, really sees you, and chooses you anyway." His eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Someone like you?" he asked, his voice rough. She held his gaze steadily. "Yes, someone exactly like me." The air between them crackled with tension, with want and need, and everything they were holding back. Caleb stood abruptly, pacing to the small window like he needed distance to think clearly. "Charlotte, even if I'm cleared, even if all this works out the way we hope, I have nothing. No land, no money saved, no prospects. You have a ranch, children, a life you've built. What could I possibly offer you that would be worth disrupting all of that?" She stood too, moving to stand behind him. "You could offer me yourself, your strength, your honor, your companionship. You could offer me partnership instead of me carrying everything alone. You could offer my children a man who'd protect them and teach them what real integrity looks like. Is that nothing, Caleb?" He turned to face her, and she saw his defenses crumbling. "You make it sound simple," she smiled sadly. "It is simple. We're the ones making it complicated." He reached out then, pulling her into his arms, and she went willingly, pressing her face against his chest and feeling his heart thunder beneath her cheek. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other, and it felt like coming home. Like every hard thing in her life had led to this moment, to this man, to this feeling of rightness that she'd never experienced before. 3 days, she whispered against his shirt. "Just get through 3 more days, and then we can start figuring out the rest." His arms tightened around her, 3 days, he agreed. But fate had other plans. On the morning of the 3rd day, Charlotte woke to urgent pounding on her door. It was Jack, her ranch foreman, his weathered face creased with worry. "Mrs. Brennan, there's armed men riding onto the property. 5 of them, led by that Dalton fellow from town. They're heading toward the line shack." Her blood went cold. "How did they know?" Jack shook his head. "Don't know, ma'am, but they're coming in hard, and they're armed for trouble. I sent Bobby to fetch the sheriff, but they're 20 minutes away and these men are here now." Charlotte's mind raced. She grabbed her rifle from above the door. "Get the other hands. Anyone who can shoot. We need to slow those men down. Give the sheriff time to arrive." She ran for her horse, not bothering with his saddle, just grabbing the reins and swinging up onto the mare's back. She could see the dust from the riders in the distance, heading toward the shack where Caleb was. Her heart hammered with fear and rage. Dalton must have had someone watching the ranch. Must have figured out where they'd hidden Caleb. She pushed her horse hard, taking shortcuts through her own land, and reached the line shack just minutes before Dalton's men. She burst through the door, startling Caleb, who had his gun already drawn. "They're coming," she gasped. "Dalton and 5 men. We have maybe 2 minutes." His face went hard, all the softness from their conversations disappearing behind the mask of a man who'd survived by his wits and his gun. "You need to get out of here. Now, ride back to the house and stay safe." "I'm not leaving you," she said fiercely, checking her rifle. "This is my land, and I'll defend it and anyone on it." He looked like he wanted to argue, but there was no time. The sound of hoofbeats was already close. Caleb moved to the window, positioning himself to see, but not be seen. "There's 5 of them plus Dalton," he said, his voice cold and tactical. "We're outgunned. Our best bet is to hold them off until the sheriff arrives." Charlotte took position at the other window, her hands surprisingly steady despite her racing heart. "Then that's what we do." She saw him glance at her, saw something like pride and terror mixed in his expression. But there was no time to say anything before the riders appeared. Dalton and his men spread out around the shack, staying just out of rifle range. "Caleb Morgan," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the snowy ground. "You're surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and no one else has to get hurt." Caleb's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Charlotte saw one of Dalton's men start to circle around to the back of the shack, looking for another angle. "The back window," she hissed to Caleb. He nodded and repositioned to cover it. Dalton called out again, his voice taking on an edge. "I know Mrs. Brennan is in there with you. Seems you've corrupted a respectable widow, Morgan. I'd hate for her to get caught in the crossfire, because you're too stubborn to do the right thing." The threat against Charlotte made something snap in Caleb's control. "You want to talk about the right thing, Dalton?" he shouted back. "Why don't we talk about how you murdered Pete Sanderson because he found out about your embezzlement? Why don't we talk about how you framed me to cover your own crimes?" There was a moment of silence, and then Dalton's voice came back, colder now. "Big accusations from a man with no proof. Even if anyone believed you, you're still wanted for murder. Dead or alive, the warrant says. And I'm thinking dead might be easier for everyone." The man circling toward the back suddenly made a break for the shack, clearly intending to force his way in. Caleb fired a warning shot that kicked up snow inches from the man's boots, and he scrambled back behind cover. "Next one won't be a warning," Caleb called out. Charlotte's heart was in her throat. This was going to turn into a bloodbath if they weren't careful. Where was Sheriff Tucker? How long until help arrived? She caught movement from the corner of her eye and swung her rifle toward it. But it was Jack and 3 of her ranch hands, positioning themselves behind the barn and outbuildings, creating a crossfire that suddenly made Dalton's position much less secure. Her foreman caught her eye through the window and nodded once. They had her back. Dalton must have noticed the new arrivals, because his voice took on a note of frustration. "Mrs. Brennan, you're making a serious mistake. Harboring a fugitive is a crime. You could lose your ranch, your children. Is this outlaw really worth all that?" Before Charlotte could respond, Caleb spoke, his voice carrying clear and strong. "She's worth 100 of you, Dalton. And unlike you, she fights for what's right, not what's profitable." The compliment made her chest warm, even in the midst of danger. She saw another of Dalton's men trying to advance and fired a warning shot of her own, surprising herself with her own accuracy. The man dove for cover. "I can shoot more than warning shots too," she called out, her voice steady despite her thundering heart. "This is my land, and you're trespassing. Leave now, or face the consequences." She heard Caleb's quiet laugh beside her. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he murmured, and despite everything, she smiled. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, blessedly, she heard more horses approaching fast, and Sheriff Tucker's voice rang out across the property. "Marcus Dalton, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Drop your weapons and step away from your horses." Charlotte sagged with relief as she saw Tucker arrive with 4 deputies, and impossibly, a stern-looking man in a federal marshal's badge. The marshal must have made better time than expected. Dalton's men looked at each other, clearly calculating their odds, and slowly began lowering their weapons. Without his hired guns backing him, Dalton was just a man in his 50s, facing serious charges. But Dalton wasn't done yet. In a last desperate move, he drew his pistol and spurred his horse toward the shack, clearly intending to force his way in while his men were distracted by the law's arrival. Charlotte saw it happening in slow motion, saw the wild determination in his face, saw him raising his gun toward the window where she stood. Then, Caleb was there, moving faster than she thought possible, pulling her away from the window and shielding her body with his own. The shot came through the window, glass shattering, and she felt Caleb jerk against her. "No!" she screamed, her arms coming around him as they both went down. Outside, she heard more shots, heard Tucker yelling, heard chaos and confusion. Then everything went quiet, except for her own sobbing breaths, as she tried to see where Caleb was hit. There was blood on his shirt, spreading from his shoulder, and his face was pale, but his eyes were open and focused on her. "It's okay," he said, his voice strained. "Just my shoulder. I'm okay, Charlotte." But she couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop seeing that moment when he'd thrown himself between her and the bullet. The door burst open, and Tucker rushed in, followed by the marshal and one of her ranch hands. "Dalton's in custody," Tucker said, kneeling beside them. "And he's looking at attempted murder now on top of everything else. That was the stupidest thing he could have done." He looked at Caleb's bleeding shoulder. "We need to get you to the doctor." The next hours passed in a blur. The doctor in Silver Creek cleaned and stitched Caleb's wound, pronouncing him lucky that the bullet had passed through without hitting anything vital. Marshal Henderson officially took Caleb into protective custody, though given the circumstances and the evidence, he made it clear that Caleb was more a witness than a prisoner now. "Dalton's finished," Henderson told them in the doctor's office. "Between Sanderson's letter, the telegram we intercepted, and his actions today, we have more than enough to convict him. The murder and theft charges against you are being dropped, Mr. Morgan. You're a free man." Caleb closed his eyes, and Charlotte saw a weight lift from his shoulders that had probably been there for months. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. Henderson consulted his notes. "You'll need to come to Colorado to testify at Dalton's trial, probably in the spring. But until then, you're free to go where you please, do what you please. Your name is cleared, Mr. Morgan. The territorial governor will issue an official pardon within the week." It seemed impossible after everything, after months of running and hiding and expecting death at every turn. Caleb looked at Charlotte, and she saw uncertainty in his eyes now that the immediate danger was past. What happened now? Where did they go from here? She reached out and took his hand, twining her fingers through his. "You're coming home with me," she said firmly. "You're injured, and you need proper rest and care. No arguments." Tucker drove them back to the ranch in his wagon, with Caleb propped against hay bales and Charlotte sitting beside him, holding his uninjured hand. When they arrived, Emma and Samuel came running out, having heard bits of the story from the ranch hands. "Mama!" Emma cried, throwing herself into Charlotte's arms. "Jack said there were bad men and shooting, and you were so brave." Charlotte held her daughter tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything's fine now." Samuel was staring at Caleb with wide eyes. "Are you the man who saved Mama from the mountain?" he asked. Caleb smiled, despite the pain he must be in. "I am. And your Mama saved me right back today. She's the bravest person I know." Charlotte got Caleb settled in the guest room despite his protests that he could sleep in the barn. "You took a bullet protecting me," she said firmly. "The least I can do is give you a proper bed to recover in." Over the next week, as Caleb healed, he became part of the household in a way that felt both natural and miraculous. Emma adored him, following him around whenever he was up and mobile, asking endless questions about horses and tracking and life in the mountains. Samuel was more reserved but warmed up when Caleb showed him how to whittle, patiently teaching the 5-year-old to handle a knife safely. Charlotte watched them together from the kitchen window and felt her heart expanding with possibility. The ranch hands accepted Caleb too, especially after Jack spread the word about how he'd protected Mrs. Brennan during the standoff. They invited him to help with daily chores once his shoulder healed enough. And Charlotte noticed how naturally he fit into the rhythm of ranch life. How he worked hard without complaint. How he took direction from her without any of the resentment some men showed when a woman was in charge. One evening, about 2 weeks after the shooting, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Caleb found Charlotte on the front porch despite the cold. She was wrapped in a heavy shawl, staring up at the stars. "You'll freeze out here," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. She smiled. "I'm tougher than I look," he returned the smile. "I know. I've seen you face down an avalanche and armed outlaws. You're the toughest person I've ever met." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Caleb said quietly, "I should probably think about moving on soon. My shoulder's healing well, and I don't want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Charlotte's heart clenched. Is that what you want? To move on? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "What I want and what's right aren't always the same thing. You've got a life here, Charlotte. A good life. You don't need a former outlaw with no prospects complicating things." She turned to face him fully, her expression fierce in the moonlight. "We talked about this. You don't get to make decisions for me based on what you think I need. I get to decide that." He looked down at her, and she saw the longing in his eyes warring with uncertainty. "What if I'm not good enough for you? What if I can't be what you and your children need?" She reached up and touched his face gently, mindful of his healing shoulder. "You already are what we need." Emma lights up when you walk in a room. Samuel started coming out of his shell because you're patient with him. "And me?" She paused, gathering courage. "You make me feel alive again, Caleb. You make me feel seen and valued and cherished. That's not nothing. That's everything." His hand came up to cover hers against his face. "I love you," he said, the words rough but sincere. "I've been trying not to, trying to be sensible, but I can't help it. I love you, Charlotte. Your strength and your courage and your stubborn refusal to give up on me even when I gave you every reason to. I love you, and it terrifies me because I don't know how to be what you deserve." Tears pricked her eyes. "You already are," she whispered. "You already are. And I love you too. So stop trying to protect me from happiness and just stay. Stay here. Help me run this ranch. Help me raise my children. Build a life with me. Stay, Caleb. Please." He kissed her then. Finally. A kiss that held all the longing and fear and hope that had been building between them for months. His lips were gentle at first, asking permission, and when she pressed closer, deepening the kiss, he responded with a passion that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have nothing," he said. "No money, no land, nothing but the horse I rode in on and the clothes on my back." She smiled against his lips. "You have me. You have Emma and Samuel. You have a place here if you want it. We'll build the rest together." He kissed her again, softer this time, and she felt him finally let go of the fear, finally allow himself to hope. "Together," he agreed. "I like the sound of that." The next morning, Caleb sat down with Charlotte at the kitchen table after the children had gone outside to do chores. "If I'm staying," he said seriously, "we need to do this right. I won't live here as your hired hand or your charity case. I want to be your partner in every way that matters." She raised her eyebrows. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Morgan?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm proposing marriage, Mrs. Brennan. As soon as it's proper and respectable. I'm proposing that we combine your ranch and whatever I can contribute with hard work into something we build together. I'm proposing that I adopt Emma and Samuel, if they'll have me. Give them my name and my protection. I'm proposing a real partnership, a real family, a real future." Her vision blurred with tears. "That's quite a proposal." He smiled nervously. "Is that a yes?" She laughed through her tears. "That's absolutely a yes." They told the children that afternoon. Emma squealed with delight and immediately started planning the wedding, talking about what dress she wanted to wear. Samuel was quieter, studying Caleb with serious eyes. "Will you be my new papa?" he asked. Caleb knelt down to the boy's level. "I could never replace your father, Samuel. He was a good man who loved you very much. But if you'll let me, I'd be honored to be your papa too, to take care of you and your sister and your mama for the rest of my life." Samuel thought about this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, you can be my papa." Then he threw his small arms around Caleb's neck, and Charlotte saw tears in Caleb's eyes as he held her son. They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Silver Creek, with Sheriff Tucker standing as witness, and half the town in attendance. Charlotte wore her best dress, altered by the seamstress to be more fitting for a wedding, and Caleb wore new clothes, purchased with the small reward the territorial governor had given him for his role in exposing Dalton's crimes. Emma carried wildflowers despite the winter cold, and Samuel stood beside Caleb at the altar, proud in his role as his new father's best man. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Caleb pulled Charlotte close and kissed her thoroughly enough to make Emma giggle, and several of the older ladies fan themselves. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and the hands clearing out the barn for dancing. Charlotte danced with her new husband, while Emma and Samuel ran wild with the other children, stuffed full of cake and excitement. "Happy?" Caleb murmured against her ear as they swayed to the fiddle music. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," she admitted. "You?" He pulled back enough to look at her, and the love in his dark eyes took her breath away. "I spent months thinking I'd lost everything. Turns out I just hadn't found the right everything yet." She kissed him again, not caring who saw, and felt the last pieces of her guarded heart finally open completely. That night, in the privacy of their bedroom, Caleb carefully unlaced Charlotte's dress, his hands gentle and reverent. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A wife, a home, children. I never let myself even dream it." She turned in his arms, letting the dress fall away. "Neither did I," she admitted. "After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over, that I'd just be a mother and a rancher, nothing more. You gave me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Then we're even," he said, "because you gave me a reason to stop running. You gave me a home." What happened next between them was tender and passionate, a physical expression of all the emotions they'd been holding back for months. And when they finally fell asleep tangled together, both were smiling. The winter passed into spring, and the ranch thrived under their combined management. Caleb's experience with tracking and hunting meant they had better success protecting the herd from predators. His strength and skill with repairs meant buildings got fixed properly. His patience with the children meant Emma and Samuel blossomed under his care. Charlotte handled the business side, managing accounts and negotiating sales, and together they made decisions about the ranch's future. It was a true partnership in every sense, and Charlotte marveled daily at how different it felt from her first marriage. With Thomas, she'd always been slightly off balance, trying to fit into his dreams. With Caleb, they were building dreams together. In early spring, they received word that Dalton's trial had concluded. He'd been found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Several of his co-conspirators had also been arrested, and the mining company was under new management. Caleb's testimony had been key to the conviction, and the territorial governor had officially commended him for his courage in coming forward despite the personal risk. "It's really over," Charlotte said as they read the news together on the porch. Caleb pulled her close against his side. "It's really over," he agreed, "and our life is really beginning." She leaned into him, watching the sun set over the mountains that had brought them together. "I love you," she said. "I know I say it all the time now, but I can't seem to stop." He kissed the top of her head. "Never stop. I'll never get tired of hearing it." Summer brought its own joys and challenges. They expanded the herd, bought some of the adjoining land that had gone up for sale, and hired 2 more hands to help with the increased work. Emma turned 8 and announced she wanted to learn everything about ranching so she could run it herself someday. Samuel turned 6 and started showing a real aptitude for working with horses, spending hours in the barn with Caleb learning to gentle and train them. Charlotte discovered she was pregnant in late summer, and the joy on Caleb's face when she told him made her cry. "A baby," he said wonderingly, his hand spread over her still flat stomach. "Our baby." She covered his hand with hers. "Emma and Samuel are already ours," she reminded him. "But yes, our baby. Are you happy?" He kissed her deeply. "I didn't know I could be this happy." The pregnancy was healthy and uneventful. Charlotte continued working the ranch until she grew too heavy to ride comfortably, and even then she managed the accounts and planning from the house. Caleb was protective without being overbearing, making sure she rested enough but never treating her like she was fragile. Emma was excited about being a big sister again, and Samuel seemed slightly confused about where babies came from, but happy nonetheless. In late winter, almost exactly a year after the avalanche that had brought Caleb into their lives, Charlotte went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Caleb paced the hallway outside their bedroom looking terrified. But when the midwife finally called him in to meet his daughter, all the fear melted into pure awe. "She's perfect," he whispered, holding the tiny bundle with practiced ease, his large hands gentle as he traced her small features. Charlotte smiled tiredly from the bed. "She is. What should we name her?" They'd discussed names but never quite decided. Now, looking at his daughter's face, Caleb said softly, "Rose, like the wildflowers that bloom after winter, a reminder that beauty comes after hardship." Charlotte felt tears slide down her cheeks. "Rose Morgan, it's perfect." Emma and Samuel were allowed in to meet their new sister, and both were immediately smitten. Emma promised to teach Rose everything she knew, and Samuel solemnly announced he would protect her from anything scary. Watching her family gathered around, Charlotte felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. The seasons turned again, marking 2 full years since that day on the mountain. The ranch prospered, growing from a struggling widow's holding into one of the most successful operations in Montana Territory. But more than financial success, the ranch had become a real home, filled with laughter and love, and the ordinary miracles of daily life. Caleb proved to be not just a good rancher, but an exceptional father, patient and kind with all 3 children. He taught Emma to read tracks and understand animal behavior. He worked with Samuel on gentling horses, the 2 of them spending hours together in quiet companionship. And baby Rose wrapped him around her tiny finger from day 1, reducing the once hardened outlaw to mush whenever she smiled at him. Charlotte often found herself pausing in her daily tasks just to watch them, her heart full to bursting. She'd catch Caleb teaching Samuel to throw a knife safely, his large hands guiding small ones with infinite patience. Or she'd see him letting Emma help with ranch decisions, taking her opinions seriously and explaining the reasoning behind choices. Or she'd find him in the rocking chair by the fire in the evening, Rose sleeping against his chest while he sang softly to her. These moments, these ordinary beautiful moments, were everything she'd never known she wanted. One evening in early fall, they sat together on the porch after the children were in bed, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling air. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the mountains loomed dark against the sky. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Caleb said, his arm around Charlotte's shoulders. "What?" she asked, snuggling closer. "That avalanche. How terrifying it was in the moment, how I thought I was going to be too late to save you, how easily things could have gone differently." She tilted her head to look up at him. "But they didn't. You saved me." He smiled. "We saved each other. You saved me from a life of running and hiding. You saved me from loneliness and purposelessness. You saved me from believing I was beyond redemption." She reached up to touch his face, this face she loved so much, with its strong features and dark eyes that looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "We did save each other," she agreed, and built something beautiful from it. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Charlotte thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that terrifying moment in the snow to this perfect evening, from strangers to lovers to partners, in every sense of the word. She thought about how the hardest times in her life, the loss and struggle and fear, had shaped her into someone strong enough to recognize and fight for real love when it appeared. And she thought about how Caleb's hardships had made him into a man who valued second chances and never took a single moment of happiness for granted. "I love you," she said for the 1,000th time, and as always, it felt brand new. "I love you too," he replied, kissing her temple. "Every single day, I love you more." They stayed there until the chill drove them inside, and as they walked through their home, checking on sleeping children and banking the fire for the night, Charlotte felt a deep contentment that had nothing to do with material success and everything to do with love free, Ellie given, and joyfully received. This was what home felt like. This was what family meant. This was what it looked like when two broken people came together and made something whole. 3 years after the avalanche, on a bright spring morning, Charlotte stood in her garden with baby Rose toddling between the newly planted rows. Emma, now 11, was helping Caleb and Samuel repair the barn roof, her voice carrying across the yard as she asked questions about carpentry. The ranch had expanded again, now including a small herd of horses that Samuel was learning to train under Caleb's guidance. They'd built an addition onto the house, adding proper bedrooms for all the children and a larger kitchen where the family gathered every evening for meals. The place barely resembled the struggling operation Charlotte had been desperately trying to keep afloat 4 years ago. But more than the physical changes, the emotional landscape was completely different. The tension and uncertainty that had characterized her first years as a widow were gone, replaced by a sense of security and partnership. She no longer carried the weight of responsibility alone. Every decision, every challenge, every triumph was shared with a man who valued her input and trusted her judgment. They'd become a true team, and it showed in everything from the way they finished each other's sentences to the smooth efficiency with which they ran the ranch together. The hands respected them both, and neighbors often commented on what a strong partnership they'd built. That evening, they celebrated Rose's 3rd birthday with a small party. The little girl, who had her father's dark hair but her mother's blue-green eyes, was delighted with the wooden horse Caleb had carved for her, and the dress Emma had helped Charlotte sew. Samuel gave her a collection of smooth river stones he'd picked out carefully, and she hugged each of them fiercely. After cake and presents, After the children were bathed and put to bed, Caleb and Charlotte found themselves back on their favorite spot on the porch. "Another year," Charlotte said contentedly. "Another year of blessings I never expected." Caleb pulled her close. "I was thinking the same thing. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. That you're my wife, those are my children, this is my home. It feels almost too good to be real." She squeezed his hand. "It's real. We built it together, day by day, choice by choice. It's as real as anything can be." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I got a letter from Marshall Henderson yesterday. Dalton died in prison. Pneumonia, they said." Charlotte absorbed this news. She should probably feel something about the man's death, but all she could muster was a mild relief that he could never threaten them again. "How do you feel about it?" she asked. Caleb considered. "Mostly I feel grateful. Grateful that he faced justice. Grateful that his schemes fell apart. Grateful that I survived to build this life. His death doesn't change anything for us, but maybe it gives some closure to everything that happened." They sat watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, and Charlotte thought about how far they'd both come. From that first moment when Caleb had pulled her from the snow to now, sitting on the porch of their thriving ranch with 3 healthy children sleeping inside, felt like a lifetime, and an instant, all at once. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "The avalanche?" He nodded. "All the time. How close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you. How different my life would be if I'd been 5 minutes later getting to that trail. If I'd decided to camp somewhere else that morning." He tightened his arm around her. "I think about how every choice I made, every mistake, every hard thing I went through, somehow led me to that exact place, at that exact moment. Like everything had to happen, just the way it did for us to find each other." She smiled against his shoulder. "I think about it too, about how terrified I was. Buried in all that snow, thinking about Emma and Samuel growing up without me. And then suddenly, there were your hands pulling me up. And your face was the first thing I saw when I could breathe again. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment my whole life changed. You didn't just save me from the avalanche, Caleb. You saved me from a future of just surviving instead of really living." He turned to kiss her properly, deeply, with all the passion and tenderness that still burned between them after 3 years of marriage. "I love you," he said when they broke apart. "More than I have words for." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Sheriff Tucker rode up with a well-dressed man Charlotte didn't recognize. They dismounted, and Tucker made introductions. "Mrs. Morgan, Mr. Morgan, this is Thomas Whitaker. He's with the Territorial Land Office." Whitaker shook their hands with a professional smile. "Pleasure to meet you both. I've heard impressive things about your ranch. Sheriff Tucker speaks very highly of you." Charlotte exchanged a glance with Caleb, both wondering what this was about. "Thank you," she said carefully. "How can we help you, Mr. Whitaker?" The man pulled some papers from his satchel. "I'm actually here with good news. The territorial governor has been reviewing land grants and homestead claims, particularly those belonging to families who've made significant contributions to Montana Territory's development and safety." Whitaker handed Caleb a document. "Mr. Morgan, in recognition of your role in exposing Marcus Dalton's crimes and your testimony that led to cleaning up corruption in the Colorado mining district, The governor is pleased to grant you 320 acres of territory land, free and clear, with full mineral and water rights. The land adjoins your current ranch to the west, effectively doubling your holdings. Charlotte felt her breath catch. 320 acres was an enormous grant, worth thousands of dollars. Caleb stared at the document like he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. I don't know what to say, he managed. Whitaker smiled. The governor wanted me to convey his personal thanks. Your courage in coming forward despite the risk to yourself made a real difference. Several other victims of Dalton's schemes have been able to get compensation because of the investigation your testimony enabled. End quote. After Whitaker and Tucker left, Charlotte and Caleb stood in their yard staring at the deed. 320 acres, Caleb said wonderingly. Do you know what we can do with that much land? We can expand the horse operation. Maybe bring in some cattle. Build out the infrastructure. His mind was already working, already planning, and Charlotte felt a surge of love for this man who'd gone from having nothing to being a landowner in his own right. We can build something that lasts for generations, she said. Something Emma and Samuel and Rose can inherit, can build on themselves. He pulled her into his arms. Our legacy, he said, built from nothing but hard work and second chances. They spent the next weeks surveying the new land, making plans for how to develop it. The addition included a natural spring that would provide year-round water, several acres of prime grazing land, and a beautiful meadow that would be perfect for expanding the horse herd. Caleb's expertise with horses had become known in the region, and they'd already had several inquiries about purchasing trained mounts. With this additional land, they could seriously expand that side of the business. Emma was thrilled with the plans, already declaring she wanted to focus on the horse breeding program when she was old enough. Samuel, now 7, announced he wanted to be a horse trainer like Papa. Rose was just happy to toddle around after everyone, her cheerful presence brightening every day. That summer, they hosted a barn raising for the new horse barn they planned to build on the expanded land. Neighbors from miles around came to help, and it turned into a community celebration. Women brought food, men brought tools and muscle, and by the end of the day, the frame of a large barn stood proud against the Montana sky. As Charlotte watched Caleb work alongside their neighbors, saw how respected he'd become in the community, saw how far he'd come from the hunted man living rough in the mountains, her heart swelled with pride. He'd earned this respect through honest work and good character, and no one who knew him now would ever question his worth. That evening, exhausted but happy, they walked through the new property together, while the children played with neighbors' kids back at the house. This is ours, Caleb said, gesturing at the rolling land painted gold in the sunset light. Really ours, land that no one can take away, that we can pass down to our children and their children. I keep having to remind myself this is real. Charlotte slipped her hand into his. It's real, because we made it real. Because we fought for it, and worked for it, and built it together. You deserve every acre, Caleb. You've earned it 10 times over. He stopped walking and pulled her close. We've earned it, he corrected. This is ours, Charlotte. Everything we've built is ours together. I couldn't have done any of this without you. She kissed him, there in the meadow with the mountains behind them, and the sun setting in gold and crimson glory. That's what partnership means, she said. What marriage means. Not you or me, but us. They stood there holding each other as the light faded, and Charlotte thought about journeys and destinations, about how the path that had seemed so dark and uncertain 4 years ago had led to this moment of pure contentment. She'd lost a husband to tragedy and spent years struggling alone, but that struggle had made her strong enough to recognize and fight for real love when it appeared. Caleb had lost his way and been falsely accused, but that injustice had led him to the mountains where he could save her life, and in doing so, save his own. 5 years after the avalanche, on a crisp autumn morning, Charlotte stood at the kitchen window watching Caleb teach Rose, now 5, how to groom her pony. Emma, 13, was already out checking the fence lines with 2 of the ranch hands, her competence and confidence growing daily. Samuel, 9, was in the barn working with a young horse, his patience and gentle touch making him a natural trainer. The ranch had continued to prosper, their reputation for quality horses spreading throughout the territory. They'd hired 3 more permanent hands and took on temporary workers during busy seasons. The house had been expanded again, adding a proper office where Charlotte managed the increasingly complex business side of the operation. But more than material success, what Charlotte treasured most was the family they'd become. Breakfast around their big kitchen table was chaos and laughter. Evenings by the fire were full of stories and music and connection. Sunday dinners after church were traditions the children looked forward to all week. They'd created something beautiful and lasting, something built on love and respect and partnership. She heard Caleb's laugh from outside and smiled. That sound, once so rare, was now a daily gift. He'd shed the hardness and wariness of his outlaw days, becoming a man at peace with himself and his place in the world. That evening, after the children were in bed, Caleb found Charlotte in their room brushing out her honey blonde hair. He came up behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "I've been thinking," he said, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "About?" she asked, leaning back against him. "About how grateful I am. Every single day I'm grateful for that avalanche. Is that strange? To be grateful for something that was so terrifying?" She covered his hands with hers. "No. Because I feel the same way. If that mountain hadn't come down, if you hadn't been there, our paths never would have crossed. We'd have lived completely different lives, never knowing what we were missing." He turned her to face him, his dark eyes serious and full of love. "I need you to know something. You gave me back my life, Charlotte. Not just by helping prove my innocence, but by showing me what life could be, what family and home and belonging feel like. You gave me children to love, and a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me everything." Her eyes filled with tears. "You gave me those same things. You gave me partnership and passion, and a love I never knew was possible. You gave Emma and Samuel a father who adores them. You gave me Rose, our beautiful daughter. You gave me happiness I'd stopped believing in." They held each other in the lamplight, 2 people who'd been broken and lost finding completeness in each other's arms. "Do you remember what I said that night in the line shack?" Charlotte asked. "When Dalton's men were coming and everything was uncertain?" Caleb nodded. "You said you weren't leaving me, that you'd defend your land and anyone on it." She smiled. "And I meant it, just like I meant it when I rode into those mountains looking for you. Just like I mean it now when I say I'll love you for the rest of my life. You're stuck with me, Caleb Morgan." He laughed and kissed her. "Best fate I could imagine," he said. Absolutely the best fate imaginable. That night, they made love with the tenderness and passion of long familiarity mixed with enduring desire. And when they fell asleep wrapped around each other, both knew they'd found what so many people spent lifetimes searching for and never quite reaching. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Emma grew into a confident young woman, taking on more responsibility with the ranch and developing a reputation for her skill with horses that rivaled her father's. Samuel's quiet patience made him an exceptional trainer, and by the time he was 12, neighboring ranches were asking specifically for horses he'd worked with. Rose grew from a toddler to a bright, spirited girl who wanted to do everything her older siblings did, and usually succeeded through sheer determination. The ranch continued to thrive, becoming one of the most respected operations in Montana Territory. But through all the growth and change, the foundation remained the same: family, partnership, and love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. On the 10-year anniversary of the Avalanche, Caleb surprised Charlotte by taking her back to the ghost town. They rode out together on a clear winter morning, leaving the children with Emma, who was now responsible enough to watch her younger siblings. The old cabin where they'd sheltered was still standing, weathered but intact. They went inside, and Caleb built a fire in the same fireplace where they'd warmed themselves a decade earlier. "I wanted to come back here," he said, as they sat together on the old bench, "to remember where it all started, to remind ourselves of how far we've come." Charlotte looked around the small space that held such important memories. "We were strangers then," she said, "scared and uncertain, with no idea what the future held." "And now?" Caleb asked, pulling her close. She smiled up at him. "Now we're partners, lovers, friends, parents to 3 amazing children, owners of a thriving ranch. We've built a life I couldn't have imagined in my wildest dreams." He kissed her forehead. "Same. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night and have to remind myself it's real. That you're really there beside me. That the ranch is really ours. That the children sleeping down the hall are really mine." She touched his face gently. "It's real. All of it is real. We made it real together. One day at a time. One choice at a time. And we'll keep making it real for the rest of our lives." They stayed in the cabin for a few hours, making love in front of the fire like they had on their wedding night, talking about their dreams for the future, remembering the journey that had brought them from strangers to soulmates. When they finally rode back toward home as the sun was setting, Charlotte felt a deep sense of completion. The circle had been closed. They'd returned to the beginning of their story and found it made the present even sweeter. That evening, with all 3 children gathered around the dinner table and Caleb at her side, Charlotte offered a prayer of gratitude. For second chances. For avalanches that brought salvation instead of death. For outlaws with codes of honor. For love that transformed everything it touched. For home and family and partnership. For every hard thing that had shaped her into someone strong enough to recognize and fight for happiness when it appeared. And most of all, for the man sitting beside her, who'd saved her life and then built a new one with her that was better than anything she dared dream. "What are you smiling about?" Emma asked, noticing her mother's expression. Charlotte looked around the table at her family, at the faces she loved most in the world, at the evidence of everything they'd built together. "Just thinking about how blessed we are," she said. "How grateful I am for every single person at this table." Caleb's hand found hers under the table and squeezed. "We're the blessed ones," he said, his eyes meeting hers with that same intensity that still made her heart skip after 10 years. Every single day, we're blessed. And as the evening moved on to dessert and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life, Charlotte knew he was absolutely right. They had been broken and lost and alone, but they'd found each other in the snow and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. They'd turned tragedy into triumph, fear into love, and uncertainty into a future brighter than either had dared imagine. Years continued to unfold like the pages of a cherished book. Emma eventually married a neighboring rancher's son, a good young man who reminded Charlotte of Caleb in all the best ways. They built a house on the far section of the expanded property, keeping the family close. Samuel proved to have not just skill with horses, but real business sense, eventually taking over much of the daily management of the ranch, while Caleb focused on training, and Charlotte managed the finances. Rose grew into a spirited young woman, with her father's determination and her mother's business acumen, declaring her intention to study law so she could help protect families and land rights. The ranch became known throughout Montana Territory and beyond for quality horses and fair dealing. 3 generations of Morgans worked the land, built on the foundation Caleb and Charlotte had established through love and determination. On their 20th anniversary, Caleb took Charlotte's hand as they sat on their familiar porch spot. Both of them graying now, but still strong, still in love with the same fierce intensity that had ignited in a ghost town cabin 2 decades earlier. 20 years, he said wonderingly. 20 years since you rode into those mountains looking for me when any sensible person would have stayed far away from a wanted outlaw. She laughed, the sound still bright and joyful. I never claimed to be sensible, just determined. And in love, though I didn't fully admit it to myself yet. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling his solid warmth. Best decision I ever made, she murmured. Coming after you, fighting for you, choosing you. Best decision I ever made was digging you out of that snow, he replied. And every decision after that to stay, to trust, to love you with everything I had. You made me believe in second chances, Charlotte. You made me believe I could be more than my mistakes, more than my past. You made me believe in redemption through love. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, the same mountains where their story had begun with terror and salvation. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and beautiful, worked by their children and grandchildren, a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. This was what they'd built together, not just land and buildings and wealth, though those things mattered, but family, love, home, partnership, a life of meaning and purpose and deep abiding joy. I love you, Charlotte said, the words as fresh and true as the first time she'd spoken them. Always have, always will. Caleb kissed her temple, his arm tightening around her shoulders. And I love you. Every single day, every single moment, I love you more. You're my heart, Charlotte. My home, my everything. As darkness fell and the stars emerged overhead, they stayed there wrapped in each other's arms. 2 souls who'd found each other against impossible odds and built a love that would echo through generations. From an avalanche in the Montana wilderness to this moment of perfect peace, their journey had been extraordinary. And it was far from over. They had years yet to love and laugh and watch their family grow. But even in this moment, they knew the truth. They'd already won. They'd found each other, fought for each other, built a life together that was better than anything either had dreamed possible. They were, in every way that mattered, home.